Pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Stephanie Albracht. She grew up in rural Appalachia, which is part of her passion for the talk that she's going to be giving us today about understanding pediatric issues in modern Appalachia. She went to University of Kentucky for her undergraduate degree, University of Pikeville for her osteopathic degree. She's trained with us for the past 3 years and has been recognized as a great teacher and colleague. And she is planning on joining one of our former graduates from the program. If you all remember Dr. Tyler Williams, she'll be joining his practice in Western North Carolina. So we're excited for the avenues that have opened up for her and look forward to your talk. And please be sure to claim your CME credits by using this nice little QR reader. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So thank you guys for coming today. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about Appalachia and kind of how we got to the point that we are at now and all the pediatric issues that we need to think about here in particular. So as a disclosure, neither I nor any members of my immediate family have a financial interest, arrangement, or affiliation that could be perceived as real or apparent conflict of interest related to the content or supporters of this activity. So my objectives for today, I'd like to first kind of identify just general obstacles that mountain communities face, not just here in Appalachia, but also globally. Kind of understand some of the history and the background in Appalachian socioeconomics that kind of explains like how we got to the point that we're at today. And then review the current pediatric healthcare issues we're facing and how we can apply our knowledge of the region and our patients to our medical practice. So I grew up in Ohio, and it was a very flat area where I was at, and I mean, it was a nice place to grow up. We had good schools, safe place, and I had a really good childhood overall. And I was really fortunate when I was an undergraduate to be able to study abroad in Bavaria and Germany, and that was the first time I had ever seen mountains in my life, and they were just absolutely breathtaking. This is a photo with my host sister out at, they had like an apartment up in the Alps, and so we went up for a weekend, and I just was absolutely amazed by the scenery and the mountains and just in awe of everything. We went on lots of hikes while we were there, and just absolutely breathtaking. We went to the Schloss Neuschwanstein, which is beautiful castle that's up there in the Alps, and one of the most gorgeous things I've ever seen. And kind of this whole trip kind of started my love affair with the mountains, and kind of basically continued me to inspired me to continue working in the mountains and staying in this area. So from undergraduate, I ended up going to a very different type of mountain in Pikeville, Kentucky. It's kind of in the heart of central Appalachia. And so it was really interesting, like having that experience of being in the Alps and then coming to eastern Kentucky where things are very, very different. And it kind of got me interested in why do we see, these variations in different mountain communities. So in general, mountain communities themselves are unique. The landscape really does shape the people that live there. And it's been studied pretty frequently over the last few decades. There's a term called the mountain problematique that a lot of studies will cite. And it's just kind of this phrase that they use to describe the overarching struggles that a lot of these communities face. And kind of at the root of all of these struggles and the strengths of these communities is the concept of verticality. And that really kind of defines all these things. So with verticality in the mountains, that contributes to a lot of biophysical diversity. So you get a lot of variation in environment, you get these microcosms, you have high elevations, low elevations, you get areas that get a lot of sun, you get areas that are always in the shade, you get lots of like water sources and streams, and so things are very, very diverse. The Appalachian Mountains are actually one of the most biologically diverse areas in the United States, believe it or not, and that's partially because of the mountains that are there. They're also, with the verticality, it's kind of a source for energy. So you have a high point, and then gravity is constantly trying to pull things down to a low point. So you have things that are constantly trying to be pulled down. It takes a lot of energy to try to scale or pass a mountain, so it really makes things a lot more difficult in terms of traveling. And then there's also a lot of like energy sources in the mountain itself. So a lot of like natural resources, coal, salt, timber on the side, all that. And then fragility. So that kind of goes in with the energy. With gravity always working to pull everything down, it does make the environment a little bit more fragile. And so these environments are, if they do experience devastation or destruction, they do take a lot longer to recover because of that. And then we also have ample water resources because of the verticality. Mountains tend to create clouds and they collect rain systems, and so you get a lot of water sources that are starting from the top of the mountain and spreading down. So you get a lot of waterfalls around mountains, rivers, streams, and it's a big source of water in that sense. And then mountains are also often dynamic. So the Appalachian Mountains haven't been doing a whole lot of changing for the last 100 years. However, other mountain systems are doing a lot of changing. So they are on fault lines, tectonic plates are still moving. So a lot of these areas are a lot more prone for earthquakes. And also kind of going in line with that is the soils in these areas tend to be especially erodible. So that this all kind of, ties in very, very well with each other. So, you have the mountains moving, the soil's really erodible. These areas are really prone to destruction, and that kind of plays into the fragility as well. And then you also have inaccessibility, which is probably the biggest one that people think of with mountains. So it takes a lot of time and effort to be able to get to a mountain and get to a settlement in a mountain. But once you're there, you're pretty isolated. So you are kind of protected from the outside world, which can be a plus or a minus. And these are themes that we've seen in lots and lots of places, whether it's here in Appalachia, you see things that apply like this in Nepal, in mountains in South America. So these are themes that come up over and over and over again. So kind of building off of that mountain isolation, some of the downsides to it is inaccessible. So it's really hard to get infrastructure built and maintained in these areas. There's a really slow penetration of goods, services, people, and information to these areas because there's not good infrastructure. And because of all this, it's a lot more expensive to build good infrastructure. So overall, it's a lot more expensive to get to these difficult areas. However, on the opposite side of the spectrum, when you do have that isolation, you do tend to feel pretty safe. These areas are pretty immune to outside factors and influences, and so these communities tend to build a really strong sense of identity. And they also have to, have a little bit more of a survival mode because they are living in that harsher environment. So these communities tend to build really strong bonds, and as a whole, they tend to feel very different from communities in a non-mountain area. And then it's also nice because the mountains are a refuge for people. So mountains are kind of like a natural castle, if you think about it. They are kind of like big strong walls that are hard to get around or into. They have natural moats around them with all the water and the streams that go through the valleys. And then, it's a great place for having a higher vantage point if you need to look out and observe your enemies or, watch out for people. There's lots of examples of this throughout history. So people would seek refuge in the mountains during times of war. World War II, with people crossing through the Swiss Alps to get to safety, that was a perfect example of that. So, and kind of, this is a pro and a con, I would say. So when you do get these isolated regions, a lot of illegal stuff can happen because it's harder to enforce laws, and that can be a plus or a minus. An example would be on the plus side of things, like moonshine, that really helped Appalachia. It was a good way for people to make a living at the time of Prohibition. But on the downside, these communities are also really vulnerable to being exploited by businesses or outside forces. So they don't really have a lot of other things to protect them other than their geographic location. So, and I've always said this ever since I went to med school in Kentucky. If there's ever a zombie apocalypse, I think the hills of eastern Kentucky is probably where I would end up in. So, and then kind of a brief overview of Appalachia's history. So all these eras of Appalachia, most of them are kind of defined on the coal industry. And of course, there's going to be variations depending on what region of Appalachia you're in. But in the late 1700s, it was the new frontier. Then we get to the Civil War, and then coal really peaked after that. And then we had the Great Depression, and then coal made a little bit of a comeback, and then it crashed again. And then kind of in the 1960s is kind of when everyone was recognizing all of the poverty that was there. So late 1700s. So Daniel Boone is probably one of the most famous people to come out here. The reason why we started getting a lot of explorers around this time is because people were feeling cooped up with the really developed and happening eastern coast, and people wanted to get out into the wilderness and have some more space. And so a lot of people started heading to the mountains of Appalachia. At the time, there were still some really old land laws, which made it really easy for people to obtain a lot of land, but they were also very confusing. And so what kind of ended up happening was an unfair dynamic where a small minority of people ended up owning the majority of the land in Appalachia. And so that kind of set everything up for what happened later down the line. Originally, there was actually a lot of other mining of resources than just coal. They actually did a lot of timber, lumber checking, and they also did some salt mining at the time. The downside with all this was there wasn't a whole lot of regulation. They were up in the mountains. It was really, really dangerous work, so a lot of people ended up dying or getting severely injured from this type of work. The photo on the right is children that were mining in the mines, and so there was not a whole lot of regulation with child labor. It was an easy way for kids to start earning a living for the family, so a lot of them wouldn't complete school or anything like that. And starting in the 1912s, so we'd had, after the Civil War, all of these Eastern corporations had actually started to move into the area to start to build up some more established coal mining companies. And because the population was still pretty thin at the time, they actually built up what's called coal camps. And so they would build an entire city all built by the coal companies. And it would have a hospital, it would have a school, they would have the commissary. And so the people that were living there, they were very, very grateful for these services and these resources to come in. And it was good work. The coal industry was in high demand from all the railroads and the start of World War I. And so people were making a decent living for the most part. It attracted a lot of immigrants to the area to try to earn a living. Kind of on the downside of everything is the coal companies used that to their advantage, the fact that these people were basically trapped in the area. So they actually would have their own form of currency that they would pay the coal miners in. And you could only use the currency for those coal companies, particular camps. So these people, they were very grateful to have this work and grateful to have this income. They had all of their basic necessities, but they also weren't able to build up savings or leave the area very easily. So, and there's a whole bunch of different ones. There's probably dozens and dozens and dozens of different types of coal script that you could find online. And it's just kind of an example, this was a very small area, but there were still a lot of different types of currencies that were involved. And so starting in the late 1920s, what started happening was with the Great Depression, the demand for coal went way, way down, and so prices were slashed. The coal workers were not able to make as much money, and they didn't really have a choice. They had to accept their pay cut because there wasn't really any other economy in the area, and it was difficult for them to leave because they didn't have those profits saved up and they didn't have savings saved up that they could use elsewhere. So a lot of these families were kind of trapped in that area and just had to take what they could. It was even more common for kids to try to leave the house early or start working early and not complete school, and so that just kind of became part of the culture during that time. And then after the Great Depression, the federal government did create a lot of federal programs to try to help alleviate the economy in the whole of the United States, especially like the WPA, the New Deal. And that did have some benefit for the coal workers and their families. So a lot of them did receive benefits, but the economy never really received any of the help from the federal government at that time. And because there was a higher demand for kind of cleaner energies like oil and gasoline, the coal demand remained low, and there still wasn't really a whole lot of economy or way for these people to make a living. And so starting in the 1940s, we started to see a really high amount of poverty. JFK actually came to campaign in Appalachia in the 1960s, and he was apparently shocked by what he saw there. He couldn't believe like the state of the kids, how hungry they were, how dirty they were. He couldn't believe, there were old people that weren't able to pay their hospital bills, nothing like that. So there was a little bit of a revival with the coal demand after World War II, but it really didn't carry it over enough into the later part of the century. And, things were still pretty hurt from the Great Depression, that the area never recovered like the rest of the country did. So on the left, it's a family that's eating dinner in their cabin. As you can see, they had to use newspaper to line the walls. The kid on the right apparently had measles at the time of this photograph, and this photo essay by John Dominus is actually really, really excellent. It's very, very interesting. I think if you guys ever get a chance to look at it, it's a really good reflection, I think, of kind of what the struggles were that the people were facing at that time. So, JFK did, after his visit, he did start up what's called the Appalachian Resource or Regional Commission, and that's kind of an organization that tries to look at the root of poverty and why it's happening in Appalachia and try to come up with solutions for that. And then kind of down the line, his successor also started the war on poverty in general. So not just for Appalachia, but also for kind of the rest of the United States. And, around that time, we did start to see a little bit more infrastructure built with the highway systems and all that stuff. And so that did start to bring a little bit of relief to the area, but it's just always been really, really slow to recover. So that kind of brings us to modern Appalachia today. And so there are a ton of regions within Appalachia that all have a little bit of variance. Probably, we're kind of near that south central / central Appalachia region. Total, there are 13 states, and 42% of the population that lives in Appalachia is considered to be rural. And that's compared with the United States nation as a whole, 20% is considered rural. So we've got more than double of our people are considered to be rural. The industry nowadays in Appalachia is a lot more diverse. So previously it was basically just coal mining, and now we've got a little bit more professional industry, some manufacturing industry. There is still coal mining that does occur in Appalachia, but it's not quite where it used to be compared to earlier in the 20th century. And then the other thing that's actually pretty positive and I think uplifting is the rate of poverty since the 1960s has actually halved in Appalachia. So it used to be 31%, and now it's down to about 16%, which is a huge improvement. Obviously, we can still work to try to improve that a little bit better, but compared to where we were, and when you think about how difficult it is for this region to recover being a mountainous area, I think that's a pretty good thing. So there's been a lot of engineering feats in Appalachia. So this is actually the Pikeville Cut-Through Project. It's the other side of the mountain from the earlier photo. And this was actually the idea of a guy named Dr. William Hamby. He was a surgeon who lived in Pikeville, and he was from Pikeville. And he became mayor, and it was this dream of him to kind of reroute you can see the river used to go behind the mountain there, and now it's just like some ponds. And so the downtown would flood all the time. The train station used to be downtown, and so they actually rerouted the river and the train track to go through the mountain and take all that congestion out of the downtown. And it actually drastically decreased the flooding that they were experiencing. This project lasted from 1973 to 1987. They moved 18 million cubic feet of dirt. It cost $77 million, and it was the largest engineering project in the US and the second largest in the world, second only to the Panama Canal. So that's crazy to think that this is in Appalachia and only 2 hours away. But it is pretty impressive, and it was really, really interesting. Like, the locals were really, really proud of it when it happened. And it's still something that they're pretty proud of today, and it has made a big difference on the quality of life there. Another kind of engineering advancement that has been made is something called surface mining. It's also called mountaintop removal. This is a very controversial mining practice, I will say. So the plus sides to it is a lot safer for the workers because they aren't having to go into the mountain. But because of that, it actually uses a lot more machinery, and it relies less on the workers. And so it's fewer jobs for the miners. And overall, it does have a big drastic change on the landscape, as you can see. They're literally stripping away the mountain from the top down to get to the coal strips. And there's a lot of controversy in, like, is this actually safe? Is this actually good for the area? What are the environmental impacts of that? So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But coal mining as a whole is still a really, really important thing to this area. So there's a prominent volunteer organization called the Friends of Coal. You may have seen their stickers around town or on cars. And basically they are advocates for the mining industry and have said, the mining industry and coal is really what has, sustained the people here for so long, and so it's really, really important to them. And a lot of people do still believe in coal mining and think that it is going to come back, which, it may not. Who knows? But we will see. It's still very much an important part of the culture there. And then in terms of the pediatric population, so overall, if you look closely, the dark blue are pediatric populations making up about 25% of the population there. And then most of the counties are in green, and that actually means it's about a 20% pediatric population rate. And this is from the 2010 census. We obviously don't have the 2020 census yet, but if you think about 1 in 5 of the people that live in Appalachia are going to be people that we need to care for. And then the other thing that kind of goes along with the rates of pediatric population might be higher. However, there's a really high infant mortality rate in Appalachia. It's about 16% higher than the rest of the nation. And that is, we aren't completely sure why. My guess is it probably has a lot to do with access to healthcare and kind of the culture, and mama's getting late prenatal care sometimes, so it could be part of it. And then overall, so some of the big health issues that we are seeing in Appalachia today, and I have an asterisk on this because if you look at these, a lot of these are not issues that are unique to Appalachia. These are issues that the United States as a whole is facing. But the thing that we need to think about is, we need to realize that because it is in an Appalachian population, it's probably going to take us longer to address these issues and longer for us to actually see progress with these issues. So that's just something for us to think about. So one thing we think about is environmental health. Obesity is pretty prevalent here. And then the opioid and the drug epidemic is also very, very prevalent here. So we see a lot of neonatal abstinence syndrome. Obviously, we're seeing a big shift in what's considered a normal family unit. And so we're seeing a lot of grandparents that are taking care of the grandchildren. We see a lot of foster families coming in to take care of the kids. And so that is kind of shifting how we view caregivers. And then substance abuse, it's not just with the parents, it does become a generational thing. So these kids are more at risk for becoming drug abusers when they're older, more at risk for high-risk behaviors when they're older. And then that kind of ties into teen pregnancy as well. And we'll talk about all of these. So kind of the environmental factors on the pediatric population's health. So the big things that we think about are air quality and water quality. And the mining industry has definitely made an impact on these. Some of it has been very minimal, but I think most of it is secondary to the surface mining or the mountaintop removal. So we've done a lot of research on the mountaintop removal process, and this is kind of an illustration of what that looks like. So if you look at the top, you can see the coal seams throughout the mountain, and they start stripping down the mountain from the top down to get to the coal. And some of the soil gets dumped elsewhere, some of it gets dumped on the side of the mountain, but it does kind of impact the rest of the ecosystem at the bottom. So you start to get floods with the streams, and what gets released with this process is we get a lot of sulfur dioxide, which in small amounts is okay, but it can exacerbate asthma, and it will react with other compounds in the environment to make more dangerous compounds. Nitrous oxide isn't as dangerous, but it does get released. Carbon monoxide, which in high doses obviously is dangerous. Benzene is probably one of the scarier ones that gets released in this process. And so with long-term exposure to benzene, you'll actually see bone marrow suppression. So these kids are at risk for like anemias or immunocompromise. It also increases the risk for cancers, and then there's also possible fertility issues with long-term exposure to benzene. And then polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are also released into the air with this process. And with long-term exposure, those can also become carcinogenic for kids. And children are especially at risk for any kind of air pollution, just because their lung to body surface area is so high. And so if they do get exposed to any of these particles, they're at especially more risk than, say, an adult. And then with the water system, this process does release a lot of heavy metals into the water. So lead, mercury, thallium, selenium is a big one that they've done a lot of research on. Cadmium, chromium, ammonium nitrate, iron, manganese, and then there's been lots of studies that have kind of looked like, how does this actually impact what is happening with the people that are drinking the water? And there's been multiple research studies that show there's actually higher rates of birth defects in people that live near mountaintop removal sites or processing sites versus people that live in more traditional mining sites. And so it seems that there's an association between mountaintop removal and birth defects. And then the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, those can also actually leach into the water. And so those, again, are the ones that can be carcinogenic over time. And this is a photo of, this is a river system up in Martin County, Kentucky. This area actually had a coal field collapse on it. And so you can see there's just coal soot all in the river there. And this is where that county actually used to get their drinking water supply from. So they would try to treat this water, but it's, at this point has a lot more heavy metals in it. And overall, kind of going back to infrastructure being really difficult to maintain and expensive to maintain. There's currently a public water kind of crisis up in Kentucky. So the water mains and the water lines that have been built, a lot of them haven't been able to be maintained over time because of the high cost. And so there are lots and lots of water line breaks up there. They end up losing a large percentage of the clean water that they do have treated into the ground. And then it also contaminates water that's in the pipes through that break. And so there's boil advisories a lot of the time. Martin County, Kentucky had to close school for multiple days because their water was shut out a couple years ago. And it is something that they're really trying to work on right now. They've kind of changed their government leadership, but I think it's going to take a long time, and there's a lot of obstacles when it comes to trying to get this kind of stuff repaired. They're trying to work on getting some federal grants, and there's a lot of red tape with that, and certain rules that they have to follow. So it is going to take a while, but it's having clean drinking water is a big issue for a lot of these families. So a lot of them have to, just stock up on water bottles and all that stuff when they do make it out to the grocery store. So that's something that a lot of people have to worry about on a day-to-day basis, which I think we take for granted. Obesity risk factors. So access for food is probably one of the biggest ones for the area. A lot of these people live in what's called a food desert, meaning they don't have access to like a grocery store even within a walkable distance. So a lot of people have to drive like 45 minutes an hour just to get to a grocery store. So what these families do is they stock up on foods that aren't going to perish as quickly. So like a lot of the starchy foods, the processed foods, because it's hard to get all that food to last that long, and it's a big ordeal to actually get to it. There's not a whole lot of farmable land in the area because everything is kind of on a elevation and vertical, and some areas don't get a whole lot of sunlight, so it just kind of is a draw the straw on whether or not you're going to have an area that you could grow some vegetables in your yard up there. And then it's also a fairly sedentary lifestyle. So again, going back to the verticality and how hard it is to get to different places. A lot of people just end up staying at home all day. There's not really sidewalks up there. It's really hard to walk to different places. And it's really, really difficult for a family to transport their kid to, say, like soccer practice, because they might not have a car, or, the mountains are bad that day and they can't get through the roads, or, it's 30 minutes to get there, and so that's a lot of gas money over time. So a lot of these kids don't get as much activity as like a kid that does have access to those things. And then formula versus breastfeeding. This is one that I think we have made a lot of strides on. So formula-fed babies are a lot more, or at a higher risk for obesity down the line versus a breastfed baby. And then the other thing, with these formula-fed babies, they either have to be making their formula with bottled water, or they have to be, put that risk of, I'm going to try to make my formula with the drinking water that we have for these families. So, and breastfeeding is even better because it's economical. It's, less supplies, so, the families aren't going to be taking up a lot of space in their car on the way back from the grocery with all the formula and bottles and all that stuff. So, definitely encouraging on the breastfeeding for that. And then there's also been some research that parents that have a lower education, their children are more likely to be obese. And that kind of cycle of not having as a higher rate of higher education in this region is kind of also perpetuating into the obesity rates that are there. So, and then going to the opiate and the drug epidemic. So this is a map of drug overdose rates in the Appalachian region that was put together by the University of Chicago and the Appalachian Regional Commission. You can see it's really, really high kind of in the central region, like West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, parts of Virginia. And this is like for all drugs. This isn't just opiates. And so this is indicative of obviously a much bigger problem. It's having a big impact on the kids. Oh gosh, there it goes. And really Appalachia has kind of been the epicenter for the opiate epidemic. This all started back probably in the 2000s, I would say. And, the national conversation on opiates didn't really start until like within the last few years, really. And so it really did start kind of there in Appalachia, and it's just been spreading ever since then. So, that's something I think, I don't know if we're going to find a perfect solution for all this, but my hope is because it is a national conversation, we're a lot more likely to find solutions that are going to work for Appalachia down the line. But these kids, because there is so much drug use there, the children are at much higher risk for adverse childhood experiences, which goes on to have impacts on their cognitive, emotional, and social functioning. And that in turn goes on to make them at risk for high-risk behavior when they're older. They have higher social and behavioral problems. And down the line, this is just a snowball effect. And these kids, once they're exposed to this stuff as children, they're a lot more likely for disease and disabilities once they're grown-ups, and overall early death as a whole. So we're still trying to understand the long-term health aspects of neonatal abstinence syndrome as well. But for now, what we do know is these kids are more at risk for behavior problems, they're more risk for developmental problems. There's been some research done that they get ear infections more often, they have more vision problems than other kids. And then of course down the line, higher risk for drug abuse. So like I said, I don't know, there's not really a great solution right now. I don't know if we're gonna see one for a while, but all we can do is kind of hope and try to watch out for these families in the meantime, and watch out for these kids in the meantime, and do what we can for these kids. And then teenage pregnancy, this one isn't as depressing. So if you look, so Appalachia is really not all that bad when you look at the United States as a whole. The red is like the higher rates, and then the cooler colors are the lower rates of teenage pregnancy. And I don't know how much of this has to do with just a large portion of Appalachia being in the South, and the South in general has a lot higher teenage pregnancy rates. But when you do look at Appalachia, like individually as a region, it has a 10% higher rate than the rest of the US for teenage pregnancy. And again, Central Appalachia does seem to kind of be the hardest hit area. These, women that have teenage pregnancies, they are at much higher risk for poor outcomes, and that's probably from a variety of factors. So they are more likely to drop out of high school early, which also contributes to obesity risk of their kids. They have a higher rate of incarceration. They have lower employment rates. They have a lot more health problems because, they do take risk-taking behaviors. They haven't been practicing safe sex practices. They tend to seek later prenatal care, and so we aren't able to intervene and do the preventative health care that we typically can do. And then these babies are more at risk for prematurity. They're more likely to have a lower birth weight, and then again with the late prenatal care, that kind of affects them too. So ultimately, what can we do? That's a big question. So we'll start simple. We recognize the patterns. So obviously Appalachia has been a really hard hit area in some of these aspects, but we're not alone. And so we can learn from these outside regions, from what what is working for them versus what we can do to work for us. We're constantly going to have to work against the verticality of the mountains, and working with things are just going to take a lot longer here. We're going to have to work with worse infrastructure than the rest of the nation just because that's how things are. But at the same time, we have the advantage of having that mountain community that has that really strong sense of identity and that sense of, we are a people that can survive through all this. We need to know what resources we do have. So we do have some really awesome social workers that help us out. We do have access to some federal grants and state grants that can help us out with some of these things. So we need to figure out what those are and optimize that. And then, of course, if we can understand the root of the problem, we can try to fix the problem. So we are starting to do that with, finding these risk factors for different things. And, if we can address the risk factors before it turns into the true problem down the line, then that's going to help with fixing everything on the whole. What else can we do? We can grow in our numbers. So the more help you have, the easier it's going to be. And I think this is something that Appalachia as a whole is actually doing pretty well. So we actually do have a lot more doctors than we used to. There's a total of 10 pediatric residencies in Appalachia. And technically they count Pittsburgh, but okay, that's fine. That's whatever. So, we're starting to draw in a lot of trainees to these areas, letting them see what the need is here and kind of helping them establish roots here to hopefully kind of stay in these areas and help out these people that do need our help. There's been a lot of osteopathic medical schools that have opened up recently, in addition to the longer well-established allopathic schools. And so those medical schools are also kind of building up that pool of helpers that we can use down the line. So, and then another thing that I think is really important, and there's a difference between telling a family what they need to do for their kid and a difference between this is exactly how we're going to do it. So you can tell a family your kid needs to lose weight, you need to eat healthy, you need to exercise, and that's going to help to an extent, but when they go home, they're going to just be left wondering how do I do this exactly? And so I think it's important for us and, for these families that we do get into the clinic, being really specific with what we want them to do. So, study their lifestyle. Okay, are you drinking sodas? Okay, you're doing 5 sodas a week. I want you to only drink 1 soda a week, and we're going to see you back, in 2 months, 3 months, and check in on that goal. Or, hey, I want you to start eating a vegetable with every little meal. So starting with these small, specific goals to help out these families, I think is going to be really important down the line. And then also, we are becoming more aware of these adverse childhood experiences and how it does affect these kids down the line and into adulthood. And so the more that we are, being aware of those kind of events and being aware of development and making sure that we emphasize with these families that it's really important for you guys to bring your kids in for a well child check, the earlier we can intervene and the less likely we're going to have to try to fix something that's broken down the line. So prevention is going to be key in total. And then when it comes to our teenagers, it's really important for us to be comfortable with our HEADS questionnaire. So making sure we can assess properly their high-risk behavior and intervene on that and kind of talk about all that. And I think it's also really important for us in this area to feel comfortable with counseling on birth control options for these patients as well, because, again, it comes down to prevention. And then we can also contribute to and review our forthcoming literature. Yeah, that seems pretty straightforward. So there's been lots of studies that have come out on Appalachia, and another thing that's interesting is we can also look at studies and research from other mountainous areas in the globe, not just Appalachia, and kind of apply what they're finding to us. There's been some NAS research here. Honestly, I really think that we are a prime location for us to be getting involved in that kind of research, because if we can find a solution here, then there's a very good chance we can fix it for the rest of the United States, just because here it's going to be so much more harder to fix everything. Dr. Skitsina has done a lot of the research as well on this kind of stuff, and when I was looking for articles for my grand rounds, one from her was the first thing that came up, so it was kind of funny. And then advocate. So being aware of the issues that these families and these kids are facing, having access to the clean water, and doing what we can to try to promote healthy lifestyles and make sure that these kids are getting the support they need from any laws or grants and all that kind of stuff. And then the last thing is we can hope. So there was a really good study, I think, from a few years ago, where they looked at, they trained teens in Appalachia to mentor younger school-age kids on healthy eating habits. And once those kids did do that and they went through the mentorship, they were a lot more likely to adapt healthy eating habits. And so that for me, that gives me a lot of hope that, obviously we do have these problems, but it's not going to be totally immune to changing everything. So it's going to start very slow. It's going to start with the people within the culture. And once we can achieve that down the line, we can get our kids healthier, we can get Appalachia into a more prosperous and a better place for our kids to live down the line. But overall, we've made a lot of progress, especially since the Great Depression and the 1960s. So I think overall, we're on the right track. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
That was a great talk, by the way. And I was just curious, do you know if depression rates are higher in Appalachia than the rest of the country?
So that's a really good question. I don't think there's been I couldn't find a whole lot of research on depression in adolescents and kids. I didn't really look into the adult literature as much, but that would definitely, kids that do experience those adverse childhood events, they are a lot more higher likelihood to go on to develop mental illness such as depression when they are older. And so I would say that with the higher rates of adverse childhood events that we're seeing in the area, those kids would be more at risk for it, would be my kind of how I would interpret that. But there was a very interesting study as well that they looked at kind of how well kids could estimate what their weight was if they were obese. And what they found was, especially Appalachian boys, they had some of the worst estimates on how much they weighed, but they also had the highest quality of life, like how happy they were. So, yeah. So. Sometimes being oblivious is blissful. So.
You had a slide about teen pregnancy rates by the United States. I didn't know, is there any correlation between those rates and in different states' sex education laws?
That's a really good question. I didn't. The question was if there was a correlation between state laws for public sex education and teen pregnancy rates. And I didn't look into that specifically, but the South is known to be a little bit more conservative and generally as a whole does do a lot more abstinence-based education. And from what I understand, that does kind of play a role into it, but I don't know, if that, how big of a role that plays, so. Anybody else? No? All right.